Thank you very much, John Kay, for a lecture that was at once erudite, remarkably simple in explaining such complicated matters, and entertaining. No doubt there are lots and lots of questions. Who would like to start? Please put your hand up, or please go to, there are mics, 2 mics stationed on either side, and give us your name, your affiliation, if any.
I'm Tan Quat Hoon. I'm just a citizen of Singapore, not a student. I just want to know, where are we now? I mean, with all this thing that has happened, what kind of hole are we in now? And as a citizen and just a homemaker or housewife, what should be my concern as a person who is thinking of my own children's future when people are playing around with money like that? Thank you.
I mean, it's a central question. I mean, Rahm Emanuel, who was President Obama's chief of staff immediately after Obama's election, famously said, you should never let a good crisis go to waste. But actually, we did let a good crisis go to waste. There was an opportunity to implement substantive reform of the financial sector in 2008, and that opportunity was not taken. My view is that given the political power of the financial services industry lobby, and that's something I haven't talked about in what I've had to say today, but it's a very important part of this overall picture. The prospects now of getting meaningful reform ahead of another crisis are essentially negligible. If I ask what I'm doing in this book, I hope I'm writing a manifesto that will be available to politicians in the next financial crisis. Because what happened in 2008 was when central bank governors and others went into finance ministries and said, you know, the financial system of the world is about to collapse and bring your economy to a halt. They pulled out the taxpayers' checkbooks and said, how much money do you need to stop this? And I can't blame them for doing that altogether. But I think we should have a better response next time round. And that's why I'm putting forward the requirements I see for structural reform and for changes that impose effective personal responsibility on the people who are in charge of this industry.
Okay. Yes, gentleman over there.
Hui Kan here, a private investor. I got a sense that you probably belongs to the group that's probably unconventionally right instead of conventionally wrong. What I'm interested to know is, what do you do with your own investment? That you know what you have said. What action do you take to deal with your own?
I wrote 3 or 4 years ago a book for British investors, which was designed to give some guidance as to how people should invest their own money, of which one of the key elements was to say the safest way of increasing your return on investments, or the lowest risk way of increasing your return on investments, is to pay less to the financial services industry. And that means really taking your finances into your own hands and building for yourself a wide-ranging, diversified portfolio. Part of the good news is actually the internet and the availability of other online instruments makes it much easier for people to do that than was true 20 or even 10 years ago. But I can't give you an overall guidance on how to invest your funds in this kind of talk or this kind of arena. What I can say, however, is that one of my projects at the moment is to work on a new edition of that book, and we've decided to not only to produce a new edition, but to produce, as it were, an international version that is designed not just for British investors, but for people in the world, whoever they might be. So come back in a year's time, and I'll be delighted to sell and sign a copy of that book for you.
My name is Tan King Sui. I'm just an ordinary person. My question is, you're writing a new book, and you told us about how bad the modern capitalist system is. Have you thought of the good old days when we just barter? I read one book some years back by Salisbury. It's about bartering in New Guinea some years back. People just barter, that's all. You know? So, in the new book, can you look back to what we were doing, we were Stone Age, when you were living the Stone Age, we were living the caves, and bring back to today the rotten system we have in Wall Street? Will it provide insight by looking back? Thank you.
I'm not sure we want to go back quite to the Stone Age, but I do remember that I used to tell students when one started to explain why money came into being, that if there wasn't an instrument called money, I would have to find, in order to get my tap fixed, a plumber who wanted a lecture in economics. And I thought that might be quite hard work. The strange thing that has happened in the modern world is it is actually possible to try and locate through the internet a plumber who wants a lecture in economics. And if there is such a person anywhere in the world, and there may not be, we can track him down. So I think you may be right. And actually, the world in which the currency we know it came into being is no longer as relevant in a world in which communication is so much easier it is today. And that's why I said, the payment system is perhaps the area of finance that is most prone to complete disruption. And I speculated about what our children and grandchildren would think about all of this. I'm sure they will be living in a very different world to the one we're used to in that respect.
So I'm an ordinary citizen as well, and my question veers into politics a little bit. Given that Iceland too suffered in the financial crisis and was devastated, in fact, yet it did manage to throw a lot of the irregular financiers and have convictions, in fact throw quite a few of them and into long-term convictions. In the US and in the UK, there were very few convictions, and they were of secondary operators, lower down the rung, and they were for far shorter terms. Given what happened, would you say that there is a moral vacuum, so to speak, in neoliberal economics? And if you agree, how would you say we counter that? Thank you.
I think Iceland was, in a sense, devastated, but I'm bound to say when I went there last summer, I didn't feel Iceland felt particularly devastated. In fact, as you know, they basically allowed their banks to collapse, unlike most of the rest of the world, because the Icelanders had no alternative. But having done so, they have recovered from that very rapidly. More broadly, your point is that Iceland has thrown a few bankers into jail, and Iceland is actually really the only country that has done that. And I think you're right to describe a moral vacuum. You could see in these last clips people who were occupying that, operating in a moral vacuum. And for me, the key to this is imposing personal responsibility so that people cannot say the kind of things which they said in front of that Senate committee. If you ask why there have been no prosecutions of major players in Britain and the United States, the answer is because it is believed to be virtually impossible to establish that these senior individuals had actual knowledge of fraudulent practices. And that is true even of the grossly fraudulent practices like the LIBOR fixing or the Forex fixing scandals which are now emerging. When Bob Diamond, who was then chief executive of Barclays, went before a British parliamentary committee in one of these Senate hearings. He said he was physically ill on learning about the exposure of the libus fixing scandal in his bank. Quite what the nature of his physical illness was, he didn't go on to explain, and I don't think any of us want to know. But as far as I'm concerned, it should be the case that the people who are responsible for the culture of these banks actually carry the responsibility for it. That in crude terms, if you take the bonus, you take the rap. And that means a legal structure that says, if you are in charge of a den of thieves, it is enough to show that it was a den of thieves and you were in charge of it. You don't have to show you knew it was a den of thieves and to say you actually thought it was a monastery and you completely misunderstood what was going on. It's not and should not be a defense for people who are paid millions of pounds a year for the jobs they're doing.
Hi. Thank you for the great book, by the way. I'm asking a question as sort of a follow-up, and as someone who's lived in a country in which lawyers are widely feared, and then in another country where they're essentially placeholders and kind of ignored, I'm asking this as not an effort to tar the legal industry, which I believe is very important. In your book, you spoke of Lehman Brothers being systematically important, not because they actually provided substantial value to the economy in their services, but more in the fact that they sort of employed this massive apparatus, including accountants and a lot of lawyers. Do you believe that there is collusion between the legal industry and this sort of, the room you spoke of earlier, in which people are essentially making money off of trading with each other and not actually doing much for the economy?
I think the legal profession is clearly supporting it, and in some ways in a rather adverse way. I mean, you may know that one of the instruments at the center of the Lehman collapse was something called Repo 105, and Lehman essentially shopped around until they found a favorable legal opinion on the propriety of that particular transaction. And I have to say it was in London that they found the favorable legal opinion, with the result that most transactions of that kind were actually channeled through London. And the same was actually true of the credit default swap, which I was selling earlier in this talk. The International Swaps and Derivatives Association, when the credit default swap came into being, asked for a legal opinion on whether it was gambling, the Lloyd's coffee shop, in which case it would have been regulated and subject to the legal structure around about gambling, or was it insurance, in which case it would be subject to the regulation that surrounded insurance. And the London QC, they asked, came up with the opinion that they hoped he would come up with, which was that it wasn't either of these things, and hence it couldn't be regulated and taxed as a gamble, and it couldn't be regulated and taxed as an insurance policy. And the United States then followed up that rather benign regime by legalizing things, making clear that things were legal in the United States as well, with the consequences which we all know. So the legal profession is in this sense partly responsible. But I don't think we should use the word collusion. I mean, it's not as if there's a great conspiracy by people to, well, there are elements of conspiracy to defraud the public, but there isn't, as it were, general agreement that this is a way to get money out of suckers, even if that is what does in fact happen. What I believe happens is that people behave roughly in the way they're expected to in the environment in which they find themselves. So if they go into a financial institution that in any ordinary language is a corrupt culture in the way Lehman does, they either behave in the way people in Lehman do, or they leave, and some do one and some do the other. And the same is true of people who join an eat what you kill law firm and so on. We make a mistake really if there are bad people in the world, but most people are part good and part bad. And if they behave badly, it's very often because of the system and the environment in which they're operating. And I think that's broadly true of the financial system.
Thank you.
Gentleman over there.
My name is Anant Nageshwaran. The question is related to your answer to this previous question. Is the regulatory capture by the financial industry in the US and the UK, is it merely a case of intellectual capture, or is there something more to it?
I think in the United States, it's more corrupt than that. It's centered around campaign financing very largely. And very little, I think, since the United States is the most important actor in this game, very little will happen until that particular nexus between campaign finance cash and political decision making is broken. In the UK, which is probably the second most important actor in this game, I think it is much more intellectual capture. Intellectual capture of various kinds. Part of it is that the regulators went to the same graduate schools, many of them have worked in the same industry. They simply see the industry through the same lenses that the industry itself sees itself. And there is the element that you might think corrupt of the revolving door, that if you're a smart person in a regulatory agency, you will get rather more employed. There is employment available to you on the other side of the fence, which is probably rather better remunerated. But I think intellectual capture is a larger part of it in the UK. Politicians don't really understand what is going on here. They see that people in the city are wealthy and smart, and they defer to that.
I understand that the UK has decided to ring-fence what we know in the old days as the banking, the utility functions of banking. What do you think of this idea of ring-fencing? Is it going to address the issues that you talk about in your book?
I think ring-fencing is an essential beginning, and real ring-fencing, and as you will have probably seen in the UK, there is now, particularly since the last election in the UK, rather heavy pushback by the financial services industry against the reform package which was in the process of being implemented. So I hope we will get to ring fencing. But for me, that is only the first step, that within investment banking, you typically have investment banks engaged in corporate advice, securities issuance, secondary market making, own account position taking, and asset management on behalf of retail and institutional clients. And I think you just have to list all these functions to see that each one of them effectively comes into conflict with every other. I would like to split up these institutions so that they're more focused institutions delivering essentially single services and having direct relationships with their customers. And that goes back to the discussion we had earlier about Lehman's importance. I said Lehman was a systemically important financial institution, but not an important financial institution. By that I mean that I've heard loads of people since 2008 say it was a mistake to let Lehman go bust. I haven't heard any of them say it was a mistake to let Lehman go bust because I really miss the services that Lehman used to provide to its clients. It was the systemic part that was important.
If I could interject something small there, how would, following on from your comments on ring fencing, how would you respond to Swiss bankers or German bankers who extol the virtue of universal banking and say that this is absolutely critical to their economies?
Well, universal banking worked pretty well in Switzerland and Germany up till the 1980s, essentially, when these banks were run as conservative institutions. What happened in the 1980s was we removed the implicit or explicit restrictions that stopped British and American banks turning themselves into financial conglomerates. And the continental universal banks then, in effect, reinvented themselves on Anglo-American lines. So that Deutsche Bank as universal bank today is very different from the Deutsche Bank that was Deutsche Bank of the 1970s. The Deutsche Bank of today has become, in effect, a very large hedge fund attached to a retail deposit bank in Germany. And I think if the German taxpayer understood the extent to which Germany is underwriting this very large speculative market activity, they would want to introduce the same kind of ring fencing that we are, I hope, groping towards in Britain.
But would you ultimately advocate the same solution for them, that Deutsche Bank should be split up?
Yes, I would.
Okay.
But that would involve, the primary thing that would involve would be Deutsche Bank selling off something it did not have until the 1980s.
Okay. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Giacomo and I'm a student here at the Kuan New School. So in your book, you mention muckraking journalists, and in the movie The Big Short as well, there is a scene with the Wall Street Journal journalist who refuses to follow the lead that he's given about this sort of selling of subprime mortgages because it will hurt his job. So my question there is, where was the New York Times, The Guardian, The Economist, Financial Times, etc., in the run-up to the crisis? Where are they now? Is there more investigative journalism that is being done around these issues? Because if the regulators aren't acting, then the other critical element in our societies, which are newspapers, the media, should maybe come in and fill in this role and provide the public with this sort of information. Thank you.
It's a good and interesting question, and we were talking earlier about regulatory capture. There's also, I think, a form of both journalistic capture and academic capture, as a matter of fact. The two natural resources who ought to have been talking truth to power, as it were, as you're describing, investigative journalists on the one hand and academics on the other. Now put yourself in the position of a journalist who is writing for the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times or another major newspaper and is dependent for his news on people in a particular sector being open with him. What happens, I think, is that you either find yourself being absorbed into the industry or you find yourself writing things that are hostile to the industry and being ostracized by it. And that makes it harder to do your job. So I think what we see in the press, actually, is the majority of journalists that cover a sector like this are pretty sympathetic to the people who are within it. And the few people who stand out against that are often pushed into marginal positions in which what they write is motivated by kind of often quite ill-informed hostility. And you can describe the same as having happened, I think, in relation to the academic world. In a sense, the power of corporate interests in the modern economy extends very widely into the control of information.
Do you have any ideas how this might be addressed?
The largest thing, I think, is more understanding on the part of the public of some of these issues, both the issues within the financial sector itself and the issues of these kind of mechanisms of capture. Because if there was more understanding of that kind, there would be more of a market for the honest reporting and the honest analysis that we actually want journalists and academics to do. And at the moment, their market is very limited. What I'm hoping to do in a book like this, actually, is to try and develop the kind of levels of education among intelligent people outside finance that enable them to pursue these kind of questions. Sometimes when I've described this book, I'm saying its purpose is to explain to audiences like this one what it is you are actually angry about. And I think that's an important role to play in these kind of developments.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm a researcher at the school. So to take up from that theme that you just brought up, so you've outlined the problems that we've gone through and are facing. So this being divorced from social reality, this financial system, but also you did say that the solution is not more regulation. And I want to pick up from what you briefly mentioned, that you say the world of the future where our grandchildren will be living in, deposits will be antiquated. I want to ask you, what do you see as the way out of this self-referential system that is probably not from reform from the government, but from maybe civil society, from private sector, from maybe entrepreneurs, technology? What's the way out, the solutions of the future?
The essential change, as far as I'm concerned, is to think it's much more vertical than horizontal. I've described at the moment the world in which people in the financial system are trading with each other. I would like to see the vertical linkages in which, as it were, asset managers, for example, have a prominent role in my world, and what they're doing, or what they should be doing, is taking money directly from savers and placing it in assets which might be corporate, or it might be business investment, or it might be property or infrastructure assets, but in assets and activities that they themselves understand. So the institution like Lehman, which is entirely engaged in trading in secondary markets with assets that other people have created, that kind of institution no longer serves a substantial role which it has had up to now in the financial system.
Thank you. Gentleman.
A gentleman just now has talked about going back to the Stone Age, which I think is a bit extreme. You've spoken about the financialization of the global economy, but I would like to pick on another culprit, which is actually the free market economy, which I think is somewhat dysfunctional. A big player on the international stage now is obviously China, and it's causing a lot of disruptions. But this is where we have the gap between the real economy, where people actually do things. And this is where the Chinese government has actually been doing a very good job in reforming the economy from industrial to services. I mean, we hear a lot about the Chinese currency, we hear a lot about the Chinese stock markets, we hear less about the developments in Chinese healthcare, education, entertainment, and so on, right? There's an event taking place now in Davos, right? And what comes out very clearly is that you have the free market countries and you have China, right? They are communists, right? And so they are a bad system. We cannot admit that communism has the right formula. But what China does have is very strong leadership, all right? And it's taken strong action against corruption, which is not happening in other Western countries. You talked about bankers and regulators. Another gentleman has talked about lawyers.
Will you wind up, please?
Yeah, but it's not just all these people, right? It's accountants, it's bond rating agencies, remember the AAA rating, right? So I'm saying that it's not just financial socialization, that actually we are all participants in a free market economies, and there are a lot of inbuilt weaknesses in the system which need to be addressed, not just financialization.
Well, financialization certainly isn't the only economic problem the world faces by any means. But I think our experience is that all the prosperous societies of the world are in some loose sense market economies. But there are market economies in different senses in different places. And the kind of market economy that functions effectively is actually rather culturally specific. So I believe that markets work, but markets work by being embedded in particular communities and respecting and drawing on the values of these communities. So I'm doing a bit of selling for my various books in this. I have another book, 10 years old, called The Truth About Markets, which I'd recommend round about the thesis that market economies are fundamentally culturally embedded. And some people have asked me when I talked about that book, so we don't quite get where you're coming from. Are you for markets or against them? And I never found a polite way of saying, that is a really stupid question. I'm no more for or against markets than I'm for or against the sun rising in the morning. Or at any rate, it doesn't matter what I think about it. It's just a fact of our economic life. And what we have to do is try and understand it and manage it as best we can.
Thank you. I think we have time for just one more question. Gentleman over there.
Hi, Professor. I'm a student from NUS, and I have a question about, like, in the past 20 years, we can see there's a blooming of the financial industry. At the same time, the manufacturing industry is staggering, and we have the aging societies coming out. So do you see any links between these two phenomena? We have a staggering manufacturing, but the blooming financial industry. And in the aging world, when we have more people is relying on the financial investment return, that means we have more investors than the people who really do the things. But how come we can still getting like the financial return bigger, like higher than the actual economy grows, but at the same time we can see the inflation is not that much?
I think there's a danger here of what I've sometimes called manufacturing fetishism, which is that people believe that real wealth is embedded in physical goods and everything else is in some way lightweight and frivolous. There's also some kind of deep sexism behind that, and that real work is what men do with hammers and hot steel and things like that. Whereas really hard work, like washing up, is woman's work and doesn't count as real work. I think we need to think ourselves out of these kind of categories. You know, the fact is that modern manufacturing of a traditional kind has very largely migrated to low-wage economies and will go on doing so. That's the product of globalization. And that means in most countries the proportion of manufacturing activity will decline as these economies become more prosperous, though there are important exceptions to that. You know, Germany, for example, retains a large manufacturing sector, which is basically specialist in niche capital goods products for which are price insensitive, and if they're very well produced by rather well-trained people, the purchasers don't very much mind how much they pay for them.
Would you mind taking one more question?
Yeah, sure.
Go ahead.
You haven't said much about where we are now. Are the institutions any more stable? Is the trading any more reliable? Are the players any more moral? And would you agree with some who are now saying that we're on the cusp of yet another financial crisis? And very quickly, given that Antonin Scalia from the Supreme Court will be here fairly shortly, I'm just wondering what you would ask him regarding the point you made earlier on about the relationship between campaign finance and the way the whole system operates.
I've never been asked the question before, what would I say to Justice Scalia? And I think I need a little bit of notice to think of my answer to that. I don't think he and I are people who have a great deal of common ground, I'm bound to say. To go to the broader question of where we are now, have we solved it? Well, what we've done has been largely cosmetic and superficial, in my view. And actually, the underlying mechanisms of financial crisis, which we saw in the slide which I described, we saw their incidence. We've seen in the last 20 years the Asian market and emerging market debt crisis of the 90s. We saw the new economy boom and bust around about the turn of the century. We saw the credit expansion that went through 2003 to 2008. We have in Europe this slow-burning Eurozone crisis. All of them are, in one sense, very different crises. In my view, all of them have the same fundamental causes, which have not, in my view, been addressed. So yes, I think we are on the cusp of another financial crisis. I'm sure it won't be exactly the same as any of the previous crises, because that isn't exactly what happens. But that we will go through them until we implement some of the kind of reforms of structure and behavior that I've been describing. I'm afraid I believe that we will go through more before we arrive at a resolution.
Okay, well, on that note, unfortunately, it's time to end this session. Let me thank John Kay for an absolutely gripping lecture. Thank you, by the way, for some very interesting and penetrating questions which elicited some gripping responses. Thank you once again.